Welcome back. Indigenous languages around the world are very complex. They are composed of various dialects. Our next guest is a defender of the native tongues of Latin America. Her research promotes the indigenous culture through literature. Her projects attend to those whose language is at risk of disappearing by helping shape the development of grammatical tools in various indigenous tongues. I speak with Yasnaya Aguilar. She is a Mexican linguist, translator, and essayist.
There are currently more than 7,000 languages spoken worldwide. According to the UN, in the next 100 years, half of those languages in the world could be extinct. Yasnaya Aguilar is trying to reverse this trend.
Describe for me your work, what attracted you to it, and the value you get out of it.
I'm a linguist. I am a writer too. And since my mother language, my first language is Mije language, an indigenous language in the south of Mexico, I always been involved with language diversity because when I was a child, I used to hear different language in my context, indigenous language. So for my grandmother, words, language was very important for her, and she used to tell us about traditional stories and traditional poetry, ritual language. So language and words has been very important to me since then.
It's also important because the languages are threatened in a sense, aren't they? They're disappearing. I mean, I saw a presentation you gave, and it's shocking. I mean, when you look at the number where you start on the chart where it's, I can't remember what year it was, like thousands, and then now the number is much lower.
Yes, and the proportion. In the early 19th century, the 70% of population in our country was speaking in different indigenous languages. And at the present, is like 6% of population. So I think it's because of the national state, the program, and the policies of the Mexican nation state. It's like one state or one nation has to speak just one language, and I think that's not necessarily true. It's like we need to enjoy diversity, and but for Mexican government has another plans for language diversity, and I think every state in the world, for example, France or the United States, it's like
that's where I was going to go with this.
There is a movement, the English-only movement,
right.
And this idea, nationalism, is encouraging monolingualism.
Yasnaya is a graduate from the University of Mexico, where she studied Hispanic language and literature. As a linguist and translator, her work is primarily focused on Spanish and the indigenous languages of Mexico.
I think the pressure that you're seeing in Mexico, you can drop that in any country around the world, right? I mean, this is indigenous people. There's been efforts to erase their culture, to make them more homogenized, to do away with language. And there's a great loss when that happens. And do you feel like it's been under attack for a long period of time? Has it subsided somewhat, or is this still an issue out there?
I think it's still, we are facing many indigenous languages are facing many threats. For example, the racism and because, for example, at the present in Mexico we have laws or a legal frame to protect the languages, but still in the everyday life, government is acting like in Mexico there is just one language. So I think we need to change not only the law, not only constitution, not only the legal frame, but we need to change the everyday function of everyday life of a state. And we need to fight against racism, because racism is supporting the language erasing.
Last year I was in Nuuk in Greenland, and a woman, young indigenous leader, got up and spoke. And what I find fascinating about what she said in Greenland, which is quite a distance from Oaxaca, is a lot of what she said was a lot of what I heard when I listened to you talking about some of the issues facing indigenous people in Mexico. The one word that was there and there was colonialism.
Yes.
Can you talk to me about colonialism and kind of the stain that it's created, not just in Mexico, but actually in a lot of countries?
I think that the colonialism is a huge structure that organizes the entire world, and it's related to patriarchy and is related to capitalism, because without patriarchy there is no colonialism and there is no capitalism. So I think these three huge structures, social structure, patriarchy, colonialism, and capitalism, go together, and I think we need to fight against them at the same time. So I think that national states are national states were the continuation of the colonial state or the colonial point of view. It's the same, because it's like, for example, in Mexico, people used to say, when we, in 19th century, the colonialism finished, but that's not true, because the entire project of the nation is from a Western point of view. And since 300 or 200 years ago, the world was divided into nations, into states. Only 200, more or less. It's about 200 at the present. And in the world, there are like 6,000 different nations. And being indigenous is about being a nation without a state. For that reason, we share many political phenomena. For example, being indigenous is not about culture, it's not about identity. It's about politics. So if we define indigenous people as a stateless nation, we can understand better the situation. One historian, friend of mine, used to say that, for example, if we set the beginning of Mije, my people of Mije history, 6,000 years ago, we only have spent 500 years being Indian and 200 years being indigenous. Because for the Spanish crown, the Spanish crowns said that we are Indians, and the Mexican government that we are indigenous, different category.
Oh, interesting.
So indigenous is not like an essential feature of our people. It's like a political situation in history.
Mexico has one of the largest indigenous populations in Latin America. In 1992, the government reformed its constitution, recognizing itself as a plural cultural state.
Yasnaya, one of the things I find interesting is Latin America is home to so many indigenous communities, but most of us don't know what that experience is like. Can you describe growing up in an indigenous community? What was it like, the connection among peoples, and just kind of that description of that childhood?
Okay, I always say that I was raised in a non-Latin American context, because Latin American is about Latin,
exactly,
about Spanish, about Portuguese, but it was like something normal to me, because I thought that that's the world and we are Mije people, and there were different nations in the world, and When I moved to city, I realized that I am indigenous, that I was indigenous, because in my everyday life, I even not use the word indigenous, because there is no word for indigenous in my language. It's like, for Mije people, it's Ayukhoi, and Agots, it's non-Mije people. So when I was a child, it's like, this is normal way of life. But when I moved to city, I realized many things and oppressions. Like, okay, I am indigenous, and I had to think about that new category to me.
So the Mije people in Mexico, and if you do a Google search for indigenous nations in Mexico, the number is somewhere around 68. But if you look for language variants, it's something in the neighborhood of 364. And so people are like, well, how is this possible? Can you explain, do you have indigenous people who speak several different languages? Explain that to us.
Okay, I think that multilingualism has been part of humanity, of society since I don't know, always. But for example, in Mesoamerica, the south of Mexico, it's a cultural area, and long centuries ago, multilingualism was the natural way of being. Like, I am in this area, and I can learn different languages and use maybe one language as lingua franca, or as I don't know how do you say that in English, but do you understand that?
Multilingual, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
And but suddenly, 200 years ago, it's like one state, one language, and that we're fighting against multilingualism and against language diversity, and that language diversity is fading over the world, and in Mexico, it's a very sad situation. But we need language diversity because we need to think the world in different ways. And if you want, or if a government wants to erase the language, it needs to fight against human rights, because it's about punishment. You need to punish people for speaking a language. So I am very interested in language, but more than that, I am more interested in the people who speak the language.
Forced relocation, economic migration, exclusion, discrimination are some of the causes leading to the disappearance of indigenous tongues. Yasnaya highlights these factors in an essay she titled, "Never Again, a Mexico Without Us."
You talked about fighting colonialism and patriarchy and capitalism, the big three. And this is a fight that's not just happening in Mexico, it's happening among indigenous people, I suspect, all around the world. How difficult a fight is that? Describe for us how you go on tackling these big three as I described them.
Yes, because I think it's very, it's related to everyday life. In my everyday life, I feel that those three big structure functioning or operating on me. And for example, when I was trying to fight in an anti-capitalist fight, suddenly my male partners, are being very patronizing with me, and it's like that's patriarchy. And then when I am trying to fight against racism, for example, and we don't have enough money to, for example, film or to shoot a film about our situation, it's because of capitalism. So in everyday life, we need to see that concrete actions of that big structure, but it's in a very everyday life. And for example, if you are anti-capitalist, but you are not seeing how patriarchy is functioning, you are like Che Guevara, for example. It's very, he's very machista, but it's anti-capitalist. But if you, for example, are fighting against patriarchy, but you can see the capitalism or colonialism, your big dream is to become the CEO of a big company that is mining our indigenous territories, for example. And if you are fighting against racism, but you can see patriarchy, it's like, okay, you are being a machista activist. So it's like in everyday life, it's this for methodological or theoretical purposes, we distinguish those three structures. But in everyday life, always they are working together.
And working against you.
Yes. I think it's difficult to indigenous monolingual indigenous women, because for they, it's very obvious that those three structures are against them, because it's like being indigenous woman, it's like racism, it's playing against you, and capitalism, you're poor women. It's obvious, and capital and patriarchy, because our partners and men think that we are less value. We have less value than men.
Let me get your thoughts on this. According to the United Nations, there are over 476 million indigenous people around the world. China is the country with the biggest indigenous population in absolute terms. Got a lot of different communities all around the world. Is there connective tissue? I mean, is there something that connects indigenous people, do you believe? One theme that you can find among indigenous people all around the world, or how you could identify someone who's indigenous in China versus Mexico or elsewhere?
I think we share this feature. We are nations inside a state, and we are stateless nations. Because for me, a state kidnapped the word nation. Nation and state is not the same thing, but for Western tradition, it's like, they are synonymous, but that's not true. And I think to divorce nation, the word nation from the state. And I think that every state has an obsession to become a nation. It's like one nation, one history, one flag, one anthem, one language. And this obsession for the one, is very opposite to indigenous people. We are like, we have different gods. And for Western tradition, it's one God, just one way of thinking, just one language. It's like Western culture are fighting diversity. But I think maybe I am being unfair, because it's not just Western culture, it's these three structures.
Let me ask one final question. You have a very nice smile. I've seen you smile occasionally as you speak, but you're talking about very serious stuff. Colonialism, capitalism, patriarchy, oppression. I want to ask you, as you sit here and talk to me, and you talk about these really pressing issues, are you optimistic about the future or pessimistic?
I have to be optimistic. But when I am so sad or so worried about future, because it's very challenging, because climate crisis, it's the big challenge we are facing, and governments, it's like they are talking about another issues. This is the most important challenge we are facing. And sometimes I feel sad and very worried, but I suddenly I suddenly remember that as indigenous people, we were facing another apocalypse, another big crash that was colonialism. And against logic, we survive. And we are still here in this century. So I was thinking, okay, we have tools that the communal way of life, the reciprocity, and we can face this new challenge.
We will leave it there. Thank you so much. It's been a great conversation.
Thank you. Thank you.